What happens when everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you crumbles in a single moment? Could the people you trusted most betray you when you were at your weakest? These questions will hit the core of the audience's emotions, prompting them to reflect on their own relationships. They may begin to question the true nature of the people they rely on and wonder how they might react in a similar situation. Today, we delve into the gripping story of a millionaire who, after waking up from a coma, is shocked to discover who stayed by his side and who didn't. It's a tale of trust, betrayal, and self-discovery. The theme introduces a powerful narrative about how life's most vulnerable moments often bring unexpected revelations. The protagonist, once confident in the loyalty of those around him, faces a life-changing realization after an accident. This transformation takes the audience on a journey of awakening, questioning loyalty, and grappling with newfound truths. Have you ever had a moment where you discovered something shocking about those you trusted the most? This story speaks to all of us as we face moments in life that reveal the true character of those we care about. Meet James Holt, a man who had it all: a thriving tech business, luxury cars, a sprawling mansion, and a life most could only dream of. Known for his sharp mind and competitive edge, James had built an empire from the ground up. But despite his wealth and status, there was a deep emptiness inside him, a nagging feeling that all the riches in the world couldn't fill the void. His relationships, though seemingly perfect on the surface, were fractured. Friends sought him out for his influence, family members depended on him financially, and his romantic relationships felt transactional rather than meaningful. To the outside world, James had it all, but internally, he was fighting a battle that few could see. His family consisted of a caring but demanding mother, a younger brother who looked up to him, and an estranged ex-wife, whom he had grown apart from despite their once loving relationship. Close friends surrounded him, some genuine, but many who were only there for his success. There were those who seemed to care for him deeply, yet he often wondered if their affection was driven more by his money than by any true emotional connection. One close friend, Lucas, had been by his side since the beginning, but even he harbored secrets James was unaware of. The lavish penthouse overlooking the city skyline was a symbol of everything James had achieved. Yet, beneath the surface, tensions bubbled. His relationships felt superficial, his success hollow, and he felt disconnected from his true self. The penthouse, filled with modern art, expensive furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the breathtaking view, seemed like the perfect place to reflect on a lifetime of accomplishments. Yet, within those walls, James often felt isolated, disconnected from anyone who truly understood him. Despite the wealth and luxury surrounding him, he was grappling with a sense of loneliness, as if everything he had worked so hard to achieve was a facade. In the blink of an eye, everything changed. A devastating accident left him in a coma for weeks. But the real shock was yet to come. The revelation of who was truly there for him during this time of crisis. One evening, as James sped down the highway, trying to outrun the thoughts racing through his mind, disaster struck. A car collision left him unconscious, his life hanging by a thread. While the doctors worked tirelessly to save him, the world outside continued to spin, unaware of the turmoil that was about to unfold. His closest family and friends were called in to wait by his side, but as the days turned to weeks, something unexpected happened. The truth about who was there for him and who wasn't began to unfold in the most shocking ways. As the fog of the coma lifted and James slowly regained consciousness, the world around him came into focus. His mind, foggy and disoriented, struggled to process the situation. He was alive, but the surroundings felt foreign. The beeping of the machines, the sterile smell of the hospital room, and the hum of fluorescent lights all seemed to amplify his confusion. He had expected to wake up to familiar faces, to be greeted by his mother's comforting voice or his loyal friend Lucas by his side. Instead, the room was eerily quiet. Where were they? He wondered, a sinking feeling growing in his chest. His body felt weak, and his muscles ached, but it was the absence of the people he trusted most that stung the most. The silence was deafening. His mind raced through memories of the days leading up to the accident, wondering who would have stayed by his side during this vulnerable time. But, As the minutes turned into hours, no one came. The first visitor he saw was a nurse, who informed him of the accident, the length of his coma, and the road ahead of him. He tried to sit up, but the pain was overwhelming. Still, his mind was preoccupied with one question. Why wasn't anyone here? In those moments of helplessness, a bitter realization started to settle in. James had been unconscious for weeks, but the people he had trusted to be there, the ones he thought would drop everything for him, seemed to have vanished. Some faces that he expected to see in the hospital room weren't there. His mother? No sign of her. Lucas? He hadn't arrived. His ex-wife, whom he thought he could always count on, hadn't visited once. This moment marked the beginning of James's emotional unraveling. He had a choice. Question everything he thought he knew about the people closest to him, or accept the painful reality that perhaps his relationships were not as genuine as he had believed. His heart sank as he thought of the facade he had lived behind all these years. In that moment of vulnerability, the cracks in his relationships became glaringly obvious. The people he had thought were his support system were nowhere to be found. His success had surrounded him with individuals who may have cared about the lifestyle he provided but never truly about him as a person. As he lay there, battling confusion and frustration, James realized his journey of self-discovery had just begun. As days passed, James slowly regained strength, but the questions about his relationships only grew. His family, the people who were supposed to be his rock, appeared indifferent to his condition. His mother, despite being one of the first to hear about the accident, hadn't been by his side. She sent a few texts and made some phone calls, but her presence was absent. His younger brother, who lived nearby, never made an appearance at the hospital, despite their close bond. James reached out to his ex-wife, expecting some form of emotional support, but her response was as cold as the hospital room. "I heard about the accident. I hope you're okay," she texted, followed by an unfeeling, "Let me know if you need anything." The words hit him like a slap in the face. The woman who had once been the love of his life, with whom he had shared years of happiness, was now a distant figure. He couldn't help but wonder, was she ever truly invested in him, or had their marriage been just another aspect of his wealth and status? But the most jarring revelation came when he learned that Lucas, his best friend, the one person he had trusted more than anyone, had barely visited. James had assumed Lucas would be by his side, ensuring that everything was handled while he was incapacitated. But Lucas had only come once, offering a quick, "Hope you're feeling better," before retreating back into his own life. No late-night visits, no heartfelt conversations about the future. Lucas had all but disappeared from his life during the most critical time. James could feel the weight of betrayal pulling him further into despair. He had worked hard for everything he had, but in these quiet, painful moments of recovery, he realized that his success had blinded him to the reality of his relationships. He had surrounded himself with people who either took advantage of his wealth or didn't care enough to be there when he needed them the most. The emotional isolation was suffocating. The more James reflected, the more he realized that the people he had surrounded himself with were not genuine friends, family, or partners. They were people who had either been there for the luxury or had an agenda of their own. The realization stung, but it was also a wake-up call that forced James to reevaluate everything. The obstacles he faced now were not just physical. He was also navigating the emotional turmoil of having to rebuild his trust in people, in himself, and in the concept of genuine connection. Slowly, the millionaire began to reflect on his life, sifting through the choices he had made, the people he had chosen to surround himself with, and the way he had lived. For the first time, he started to see beyond the shiny facade of his wealth and success. James had always believed that being successful would lead to happiness and meaningful relationships, but now he was left questioning the truth of that belief. He realized that his focus on wealth had blinded him to the quality of his relationships. His success had become his identity, and in doing so, he had neglected the deeper connections that could have nurtured his soul. The people who had remained in his life had either been tied to his financial status or were emotionally distant, never truly seeing him for who he was beyond the money and the power. James's journey of emotional awakening had begun. It wasn't an easy process. He struggled with anger, frustration, and feelings of betrayal. But in those quiet moments of self-reflection, He began to understand that the relationships he had cultivated were not the ones that would truly help him grow. In fact, they had only hindered his personal development. Through the pain, James started to learn that true relationships were built on mutual respect, trust, and vulnerability, things that his wealth had never allowed him to experience. Slowly, he began to rebuild himself from the inside out, learning to trust his instincts and not just rely on the approval of others. The journey of change was not going to be easy, but it was necessary. The evening began like any other, but it would become a defining moment in James's journey. It had been weeks since he had woken from the coma, and although he had made physical progress, the emotional scars still lingered. His healing process was slow, not just in terms of physical recovery, but in regaining his trust in others. He had spent countless nights replaying his interactions with people who had been absent during his most vulnerable time, and one name stood out above the rest: Lucas. Lucas, his best friend for over 2 decades, was the one person James had always considered a constant in his life. They had been through thick and thin together, shared victories and failures, and James had believed their bond was unbreakable. But as the days passed in his hospital room without any sign of Lucas, doubts began to creep in. Despite the messages he had sent, the calls he had made, Lucas's presence was always missing. It wasn't like Lucas to just disappear. They had been closer than brothers, after all. Finally, after days of internal turmoil, James made the decision. He would confront Lucas. He called his friend and demanded a face-to-face meeting. His pulse quickened as he waited, unsure of what to expect. He didn't want to accuse Lucas of anything, but the silence between them had become unbearable. When Lucas arrived, James could barely hide the anger and disappointment in his eyes. "Where were you, Lucas?" James asked, his voice hoarse from the emotions that had built up inside him. "I was in a coma for weeks, and not once did you come to see me. Not once did you check in." Lucas, a man who had always been confident and composed, seemed strangely uneasy. He shifted uncomfortably on the couch, avoiding eye contact. The awkwardness in the room was palpable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Lucas spoke, his words clipped and guarded. I didn't want to be around. I thought it would be better to give you space, to let you rest and recover without pressure," he said, his voice lacking the conviction James had expected. "It wasn't personal, man, I swear." But James could sense the insincerity. The explanation didn't add up. Why, then, had Lucas not checked in once? Why had he ignored every attempt James had made to reach out? The truth started to form in James's mind like a slow-moving fog. He could feel it now. The betrayal, the selfishness. "It wasn't about me, was it, Lucas?" James asked, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You didn't stay away because you were respecting my space. You stayed away because you were protecting yourself, your interests. You were worried about what it would look like if you were caught up in my mess, weren't you?" Lucas didn't answer immediately, and when he did, his response was an uncomfortable admission. "Yeah, I didn't know how it would affect things, especially with your business. You know how things can get complicated when you're in a coma, right? I didn't want to be caught in the middle. I'm sorry, James, but that's the truth." The cold reality of it hit James like a freight train. The person he had trusted most, the person he thought would be by his side through thick and thin, had been more concerned about protecting his own interests than being there for him when he needed support the most. The bond they had shared now felt like a distant memory, tainted by self-preservation and selfishness. The revelation shook James to his core. He had given so much of himself to this friendship, and yet, when the chips were down, Lucas's loyalty was nowhere to be found. The emotional impact of this confrontation was overwhelming. James's heart raced, and for a moment, the room seemed to spin. Anger surged through him, but it was quickly followed by a deep sense of sadness. How could Lucas, the man he had considered family, be capable of such cold indifference? He had imagined a different reality, one where his friends and family would rally around him in his time of need. But the reality he faced was far more painful. You didn't even care, did you?" James said, his voice cracking as he struggled to control the tears threatening to spill. "All this time, I've been thinking that you were my friend, my brother. But you couldn't even show up when I was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for my life. The bitterness of betrayal gnawed at James's insides. The truth was undeniable, and it hurt more than he could have imagined. He couldn't comprehend how someone he had trusted with his life, someone who had shared so many milestones and memories with him, could abandon him when he was most vulnerable. The sense of betrayal was suffocating, as if the very foundation of his trust in others had been shattered in an instant. Every moment they had spent together, every shared laugh, every late-night conversation, now seemed hollow and insincere. Lucas wasn't the friend James had thought he was. He had been a convenient companion, someone who had stuck around as long as the relationship served him. But in a time of true need, he had vanished, leaving James to navigate the most challenging moment of his life alone. But the pain wasn't just about Lucas. The betrayal had a far-reaching effect. James found himself questioning everyone in his life. His family, too, had been distant and detached. He began to wonder if they, too, had only been interested in his success and status. The emotional toll of this revelation was immense. James felt like an island, surrounded by people who had once been close to him, but now, all he could see was their true, selfish nature. The heartbreak was profound. It was as though the people he had trusted most had never really known him at all. Their actions had left scars that would take time to heal. And yet, despite the anguish, James could feel something else stirring inside him. A new sense of strength, a resilience that had been lying dormant, waiting to be awakened. In the midst of the emotional chaos, a shift began to occur. The pain of betrayal was still raw, but as James reflected on the events that had transpired, something became clear. This wasn't the end. This was the turning point he had needed. The moment of realization was painful, yes, but it was also liberating. For the first time, James understood that the truth, however painful it might be, was setting him free. He no longer saw himself as a victim of betrayal. Instead, he saw himself as someone who had been given the opportunity to reset, to rebuild his life from the ground up. The people who had left him in his time of need weren't his true allies, and now he had the clarity to move forward without them. The weight of their presence in his life had been holding him back, and now, he was free to redefine what truly mattered. "You're not my friend, Lucas," James said, his voice calm now, but resolute. "But I will be okay. I don't need people like you around me anymore." The words were liberating, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He was no longer bound by the expectations of others, no longer afraid to face the truth. He had faced the deepest betrayal, but in doing so, he had found a new sense of independence. He understood that the relationships that truly mattered would be built on authenticity, not convenience. His journey of self-discovery was far from over, but in this moment, James knew he was no longer a victim. He was in control of his own destiny. The road ahead would be difficult, but now, he was ready to walk it alone, stronger than ever before. The weeks following his confrontation with Lucas were transformative for James. The emotional wreckage left in the wake of betrayal still lingered, but James was determined to rebuild. He knew that in order to regain control of his life, he had to take decisive action, starting with the people around him. The bonds that once held him in place, bonds that had promised support but delivered disappointment, were now broken. It was time for a new chapter, and that meant creating space for people who could offer him what he truly needed: authenticity, loyalty, and care. James began by setting new boundaries, something he had never been good at before. He had always been a giver, someone who loved deeply and openly, often without expecting anything in return. But now, he realized that his generosity had been exploited, that some people in his life had been drawn to him not for who he was, but for what he could offer. He began the difficult task of cutting ties with individuals who had only ever sought to benefit from him. There was a deep sense of relief as he let go of these relationships, but there was also sadness. Some of these people had once been close to him, and severing those connections felt like ripping away a part of his past. It wasn't just about cutting people out of his life. It was about opening space for new, more meaningful connections. He reached out to those who had shown true care during his recovery: his sister, a few loyal friends, and even some colleagues who had quietly supported him behind the scenes. These were the people who hadn't vanished when things got tough. Slowly, He began to rebuild his social circle, fostering relationships based on mutual respect and trust. For the first time in years, he felt that the people around him were there for him, not for his wealth or success, but for the person he truly was. He didn't rush the process. Rebuilding relationships and finding true trust took time, but James was no longer afraid of the slow and steady pace. His focus had shifted. Instead of seeking to please others, he began to prioritize his own well-being, his peace of mind. The toxic influences in his life, now distant memories, had no place in his future. However, implementing change was not as smooth as James had hoped. As he distanced himself from toxic individuals, the attempts to re-enter his life were both frequent and persistent. Some people, those he had once considered friends, tried to find their way back into his world, their faces masked with apologies and pleas for another chance. But James, now wiser and more discerning, could see through the facades. "James, we need to talk," one former business associate said, showing up at his doorstep one afternoon. "I've been thinking a lot about the past, and I realize I may have made some mistakes. Can we work through this?" It was an all too familiar scenario. Someone from his past trying to rekindle the relationship now that he was recovering and no longer in the vulnerable state they had left him in. But James had learned from the past. He could no longer afford to give people another chance without fully understanding their intentions. The betrayal had stripped him of his ability to trust so easily, and while he didn't want to shut people out forever, he knew that he needed to be cautious. "I appreciate your apology," James said, his voice firm but measured. "But trust isn't something I give away lightly anymore. I've learned a hard lesson, and right now, I need to focus on myself. I don't think it's healthy for either of us to revisit this." It was uncomfortable, but necessary. He had to enforce his boundaries. It was no longer about being the nice guy who was always available to lend a hand or give people second chances. It was about preserving his mental and emotional health. It wasn't an easy decision, but James realized that true healing required cutting out those who still sought to use him or manipulate the situation for their gain. But as he made these difficult decisions, new challenges arose. Old wounds, once forgotten, resurfaced in the form of self-doubt. Would he ever be able to trust again? Was he being too harsh, too closed off from the world? The questions gnawed at him late at night, and sometimes, when he felt lonely, the temptation to reach out to an old friend or family member would resurface. But he had learned that the more he let go of the past, the more room there was for personal growth. Each rejection, each closed door, was a small victory in reclaiming his power. Slowly, as the weeks turned into months, James began to notice a shift in himself. With each passing day, he felt more confident, not in the material sense, but in his personal growth and decisions. The pain of betrayal, while still present, was no longer all-consuming. It had become a part of his story, yes, but it no longer defined him. He was no longer the man who had been blind to the true nature of those around him. He was now someone who had learned to trust his instincts and value his own worth above all else. His confidence grew as he began to realize that he had the power to shape his future. No longer was he at the mercy of those who sought to take advantage of him. He had created space for himself, and in doing so, had cultivated the strength to move forward. He was no longer paralyzed by fear of making the wrong decision. Each step forward, no matter how small, felt like a victory. The more James allowed himself to let go of the past, the more he began to see his true self. The man who had been driven by external validation, by the expectations of others, was now becoming someone who made decisions based on his own principles. He was learning to listen to his inner voice and trust the choices that felt right for him. The vulnerability he had once seen as a weakness was now a source of strength. He wasn't afraid to feel anymore. He welcomed the emotions, even the painful ones, because they were a part of his journey. In the process of rebuilding his life, James found a deep well of resilience within himself. He didn't need to rely on anyone else for validation or direction. He had discovered the strength that lay dormant inside him, waiting to be unleashed. His confidence wasn't about proving something to the world. It was about proving it to himself. He had faced the darkest moments of his life, and he had survived. Now, he was ready to thrive. As he moved forward, James realized that this was just the beginning. The lessons he had learned, the pain, the growth, the healing, were all stepping stones toward something greater. His journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for whatever lay ahead. The future was his to shape, and he was no longer afraid to take control. Months had passed since the whirlwind of emotional turbulence had upended James's life. He had made it through the darkest of times, and though the scars were still present, they no longer defined him. He stood in front of his expansive windows one quiet evening, looking out over the city skyline, and felt a sense of peace settle within him. It was a peace he hadn't known before, a peace not derived from his wealth, his achievements, or his position in the world. It came from something deeper, a newfound clarity about what truly mattered. As he reflected on the journey he had taken, James understood that success no longer felt like the number of zeros in his bank account. It was measured by the strength of the relationships around him, the genuine friends who had supported him without expecting anything in return, the family members who had never wavered, and the loyal colleagues who had quietly stood by his side. These were the true markers of wealth, far more valuable than any asset he could buy or accumulate. His life had been transformed. He no longer sought validation from the superficial ties of power or influence. Instead, he cherished the moments spent with those who cared for him unconditionally, the people who had been there for him when he was at his lowest. The friendships that had bloomed in the wake of his painful awakening were his true treasures. He was no longer just the millionaire. He was a man with true connections, and that was worth more than all the wealth he had ever accumulated. The most profound lesson James had learned was that wealth did not equate to worth. For so long, he had equated his success with the value of his relationships, mistakenly thinking that the people around him were genuine simply because they shared in his prosperity. He had built his life on the assumption that his wealth and status were the keys to loyalty and trust. But in the end, it was the betrayal and isolation he faced that revealed the truth, that trust, loyalty, and real human connections were what truly made life meaningful. James understood now that no amount of money could buy genuine affection. It wasn't the material success or the luxury that defined him. It was the people who had loved him for who he was, not for what he could give them. These were the people who had stayed when everything else had crumbled. They were the ones who had proven that true wealth lies not in possessions, but in the bonds that hold us together. The lesson was clear. Success and wealth would come and go, but real relationships, those built on authenticity and trust, were the foundation of a fulfilling life. James vowed never to confuse the trappings of his success with the truth of his worth ever again. He would measure the quality of his life not by what he owned, but by the depth of the connections he nurtured and the trust he had earned. So, ask yourself, who in your life is truly there for you, not for what you can give them, but because they genuinely care about you as a person? How many of the people around you are truly invested in your well-being, not because of what you offer, but because they value who you are? The journey to understanding who truly matters in your life begins with recognizing what is real and letting go of what isn't. Take the time to reflect on the relationships you hold dear. Are there people in your life who only come around when they need something? Are there connections that drain you rather than nourish you? It's not always easy to admit, but sometimes we need to clear out the toxic relationships to make room for the ones that will bring us joy, support, and unconditional love. It's time to prioritize the genuine over the superficial. Cultivate those relationships that give you energy, that uplift you, and that stand the test of time. True wealth is not in what you accumulate. It's in the love and trust you build with others. In the end, life isn't about what you accumulate, but about the people who stand by your side when the chips are down. Your worth isn't measured by your wealth, but by the love and loyalty you share with those around you. James's journey was one of painful discovery, but it led him to a place of understanding that few ever reach. The recognition that true success is not defined by how much you have, but by the quality of the relationships you cultivate. Wealth is not about having a lot of money. It's about having a lot of people who truly care. This was James's new truth, and it was one that would guide him through the rest of his life.